So, as I said, we're just going to carry on to part 7a, and that'll probably be enough for today. So, just to mention here, one of the most common things that we end up needing to add to any database application when you're working with large amounts of data is sorting and filtering, right? Huge amounts of data in some apps, and you've got to be able to filter out, find the one that you're actually looking for or the group that you're looking for. And of course, sorting is a big part of that as well, right? Now, for those that actually were following along in that 10-part tutorial, the textbook tutorial, there was a whole section there covering filtering, sorting, and paging. We're going to cover the same thing, but I'll tell you right now, I'm going to use a slightly different approach from what was in the textbook tutorial. It has some advantages that I think that you'll appreciate. So hopefully you did that so you have the background and understanding, and you'll see the difference in the slight differences in the approach that I'm going to suggest that we implement this way. All right, so if you want to grab that copy-paste file for 7a, you can follow along in your own work. Okay. So we can add filtering to the patient index view. That's what we're going to do in 7a here. But we're also going to make use of the Bootstrap Collapse, right? We've talked a bit about Bootstrap and, kind of mostly ignored it, but you've been using it all along because it's included in the standard template for an MVC project in Visual Studio. But this here gives you some documentation specifically about the collapse feature of Bootstrap, where you can change the visibility, right? Hiding it, showing it, and so on, right? There's all different approaches that you can do, and so on and so forth. Ooh, look at that! Isn't that fun? So, lots of documentation for you right here on how to use it. Getting back to our Visual Studio then, with our project. I'll maybe clean up the screen, and we're going to start applying this new material, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to add a form. Like if I open up the patient index right now, coming to views, down here, patient index, then what do I see? Well, basically, I have the standard arrangement here that we're used to with our indexes. What I want to point out, begin with, is something we don't see. On every other one of our pages, there was always a form tag, right? But there's no HTML form involved in our current index page at all, right? It's just basically using a table for layout, showing data. Now, of course, we're using Razor code here, right? So we can put stuff in our view data and have it automatically inserted as the page is generated to be sent down to the client browser, and away we go, right? That's all this Razor code is here as well. It's just a different style of writing the Razor code, right, with an HTML helper, right? So that's good. We have all this code, but there's no form. Now, forms allow us to submit, right, data back to a page. So we're going to add a form to this page, even though it doesn't have one yet. Now, we're going to be making some further changes to it, so don't fall in love with this particular version, but it gets the introductory level job done. Now, with a form, we have a chance to define the action. So the action is what action in the current controller. If we don't specify ASP-controller, right, then it's going to assume it's going to go back to the same controller that generated this page. And the action it's going to submit to is the one named here, index. In other words, this page is going to post back to itself, posting back to itself. Method is get, right? And I wanted it to be get so that I can actually not just see as an instructional tool what the parameters are or attributes are added to the request up in the URL at the top, but later on we're going to capture them and use them to provide a more effective user experience as well, where we can actually remember the last filter, sort, everything else, paging that was set when the user comes back to a page, right? Makes it much easier if we have it up here in the get. Okay, all right, so then inside that, I simply have a div here with a form, horizontal. I have some form groups, okay? One each for our foreign keys, our doctor ID, our medical trial ID, one for a text box for our search string, okay? Then a submit button, okay? Input type equals submit, okay? And then a link, right, to go back to the index page again. Now, if you use a link to go back and don't pass anything, it's just like asking like a first request for the page, right? It's like you're coming there for the first time. You just get basically everything, right? The basic page itself. Okay, that's what we do when we click clear. It's just like a first request for the page. If we do the submit, we're going to submit all the data contained in this form, you've covered this before, back into the controller, right, into the index action. So let me just talk about, now we see down here this HTML helper, right? In the earlier days of working with this tool and other similar ones from Microsoft, we did this HTML helper approach for just about everything, right? Then they added these tags, these type of tags, right? And that made the code look cleaner and nicer in many ways. It didn't quite look so much like a program. It was easier to read. But not everything has been implemented yet, okay, using the tag helpers, right? So sometimes we're better to go back to the good old HTML helper, even as you see we're doing down here, okay? So this HTML helper we haven't used before because, let me bring up the index, or edit, create, doesn't matter which one, page again. When we come down to actually specifying those values, right, we've been using a select, okay? Select with ASP4, ASP items, and so on, right? So that's the newer style of creating a drop-down list, utilizing the tag helpers. But this is the older version, and we're going to stick with it for a couple of reasons at this point in time. One, we're pulling data that has nothing whatsoever to do with the model itself of the page, right? And we wanted to be able to remember the value when we come back to the page without having to persist it anywhere else. So we get that for free by using just simply HTML drop-down list, okay? Now the parameters we're passing here, first of all, is the basically that same collection of items in our doctor ID, the select list, that we would have passed to our normal select in our view as we've done in the past. So doctor ID here is referring to the name of a select list, okay? The third parameter along here, optional string optional label, that's all doctors, right? That in this case is what is going to be put at the top of the drop-down list. Okay? It has no value, right? It's just an option label to appear at the top. So that's where we can have like select a doctor or all doctors, as in this case, right? And then of course we have our different HTML attributes we're going to add as well, right? So we do that for our select lists for doctor ID and medical trial ID. And that will give us the same kind of effect where we can pick out of the drop-down list, you know, the doctor we want to filter by. And this is how we're actually adding that option at the top saying all doctors. Now, remember the difference. Medical trial is a nullable, right? So all, like saying all wouldn't make sense. We're going to say none, right? So there's no filter on medical trial when we just leave it as the default option at the top, which has no value. Now, HTML text box, well, it's pretty clear what that's going to do. It's going to make a text type input with the name search string, right? And then we'll basically be able to pass in whatever value in the form, right? Because these controls are all contained in the form, when we submit it to this action of the controller, they will all come through as parameter values. So maybe that's what I'll do next. Let's go to the actual controller for patients. Nope, controllers up here, right? So the first thing we want to do is here in the action, for the index, right? We want to grab the values that come from those parameters, right? So it's going to be a string to hold the search string, right? We're going to have a nullable int each to hold the other two values, the doctor ID and the medical trial ID, okay? So this will give us access in our code to whatever values the user set with those input controls inside the form that they submitted here to index. Okay, now if I were to try and run it right now, let's go ahead and do that. Let's just see what happens. Sometimes it's good to see an error and then figure out why we're getting it, okay? All right, so if I come to patients, ooh, look at that. I get a nice error. Oh, don't you love it when you see these screens come up? Doesn't it make you feel warm and fuzzy to know that the system is looking after you and helping you by giving you this nice information? So don't look at this and go, oh no, quick, click X, get this off the screen, I'm embarrassed, right? Say, no, this is wonderful because look, it's telling me exactly what's wrong. There is no view data item, right? For my doctor ID, the select list. Oh, yeah, okay. I didn't actually provide, okay, a select list for doctor ID or for medical trial ID, etc., etc. Well, don't we have code in place for that already? Sure we do, right? Think back. Well, while you're thinking, I'll scroll back down to the bottom, okay? And here is where, okay, a twist on the drop-down list approach, we added all this code, right? Remember, we added this code that generates the select list for doctors, okay? Getting doctors, ordering specifically by last name and then first name, preparing the select list so that the data value field is the primary key, and the data text field, in this case, is the formal name, all alphabetically sorted and so on. Oh, look, we also have medical trial here. Perfect. And this popularly drop-down list puts all that inside our view data. So I have a hunch that if I just call this method way up here, right in my index, of course, don't forget the brackets. Now, if I were to run again, I should have used hot reload. It would have been quicker. Sorry. I'll try to remember in the future. Now I have the data. No more error because I'm supplying the select lists, right? So here are all the docs. Now, of course, it doesn't do anything yet, right? I can click filter. Yeah, it did something. Look, we're seeing all the data values that were passed as part of the URL in the GET request, right? So I see here the question mark saying, okay, here are query string parameters. Doctor ID equals 32 because that's the ID of the doctor I chose out of the list. Medical trial ID is blank. Search string is blank. Action button equals filter, right? I didn't really talk about that, but I'm going to now. Okay, coming back here, that's something I kind of breezed over. That when we created our submit button here, we gave it a name of action button. I'm mentioning it because later on I'm going to have more and more elements we add to the page. They'll all have the common name action button, right? That'll come through as a name value pair in our code, in our controller. What good does that do us? Well, we can look at the value, right? If the action button value is filter, then we know this is the darn button they clicked, right? Whereas later on we can determine, no, they clicked something else, right? Because the value is different for the same name, action button. Starting to get the picture? All right, well, that's what we're working towards. Okay, all right, so now I have the data populating my drop-down list. That's good. All right, and here's our query is good, but I'm just going to wax political for a second here. Our idea is that, okay, this is a great query we put together. Right now, if I hover over patients, notice it says it's a iQueryable of patient objects, right? As long as it's an iQueryable, the query isn't finished yet. We can modify it. We can add new aspects to the query before we actually execute it, but only if it's an iQueryable. Now, down here, when we call toListAsync, that is when it's going to actually execute that LINQ query or develop the SQL. Yeah, I know. Develop the SQL based on our LINQ query and send it off to the database. But in the meantime, between those two spots in code, we can make further changes. Again, as long as it's an iQueryable. So how do we make it an iQueryable? Well, let me just show you when it's not. If I take out as no tracking, for example, right? Now if I hover over, it is a includable queryable, right? INcludable queryable. That's not the same thing on patient and condition. And you'll find that it is not possible, right? Certainly not easy to do what we're about to do and add more and more conditions, where clauses and so on, to the query before it actually gets executed. Now, there's two ways to actually make sure it's an iQueryable, right? One is add as no tracking, right, which we already had there for efficiency. So our job is done. The other, I'm just going to draw your attention for a second. If I can find it quickly, I'm going to bring it up here. Let me see. That PowerPoint on LINQ, right, where we talked about how we can write our LINQ queries. Remember we talked about, let me find the one slide I want here. This one, okay? Let me bring it up. Writing LINQ, okay? So there are basically two styles, right, of writing LINQ. It gives us three syntaxes: the query expression syntax and the extension method syntax. And then we can combine them together, right? But another way to make sure it's an iQueryable is to use query expression syntax. What does that look like again? Right? Well, let's remind ourselves here, right? That's where we have from, right? Optionally, you can say let, where, order by, select, and then a group if you're going to do grouping, right? And just to give you a quick example, okay? So this is written in query expression, right? From n in nums, where n is such and such, order by, select n, right? We could rewrite the exact same query in extension method syntax, right? Where we just say the name of the collection, dot where. Now, extension method syntax requires that we pass these lambda expressions, right? Which is basically like an inline function. So we avoid that, okay? And some students just have a hard time getting a handle on lambda expressions. So that's why you're always free to write your queries this way for the most part. But you know what? As you get more and more used to it, I know most developers tend to just forget the query expression and just do it with extension methods, right? So I just want to point out, if I rewrote this saying from P in, context patients, include, and then did my selects and everything else that I might need to do, then I would also get a iQueryable. Okay? All right, I'm getting down off my pulpit now. That's enough talking about, the bottom line is make sure it's iQueryable, and then we're allowed to do what I'm about to show you we can do. And that is make changes to the actual query before it gets sent off to be generated as SQL, right? Basically, we're going to add as many filters as we want, right? So I'm going to decide, okay, if Dr. ID has value, right? It's a nullable int, right? Because if they just left it as all doctors, okay, then the value is null, right? So it comes in as the value null. So if it doesn't have a value, then we won't even worry about it. We're not going to try to add a where clause, finding that only patients where the foreign key Dr. ID matches the parameter passed in up top, right? We'll only do that if there actually is a value. Well, am I done? No, I want to do that for medical trial too. Can I keep going? Sure I can. So even if there was a filter in place for the doctor ID, I can go on and keep on doing this till the cows come home. I can add more and more where clause, and it just builds, right? It builds up to a more and more complex query, but hey, it's so easy for us to do this in code. The actual search string, no problem, right? If we want to search for characters contained inside, now I'm going to take the shortcut. I'm not going to worry about the middle name again, right? But we're going to take the last name just to avoid any issues comparing, uppercase and lowercase. I'll just convert it to upper and check if it contains my search string converted to upper, right? Do this exact same thing for first name. This, of course, we remember in C#, that's a or, right? Or clause saying this or that, right? And that then allows us to test for sure whether or not the characters in our search string are contained in either the first or last name. Again, see the power of this. We can keep on adding more and more .where, right? And finally, we'll actually do the work of filtering the data as we call toList async, right? And that generates the SQL with all the where clauses involved in the SQL, and off it goes to the server, right? So let's just actually see that in operation and make sure it actually works. I'm going to have a sip of coffee while that comes up. Okay, so here we are running. So in patients then, we have our filters. Now, so this time I'll pick a doctor and click filter. And look at that. That's the only patient assigned to this particular doctor. I'm going to pick somebody else. Let's just see. All right, there's a few more patients for that particular doctor. Good. All right, so, we can live with that. Now, okay, what's the medical trial here? The Sunnybrook one. So I'm going to add a second filter, and not surprisingly, I've eliminated, okay, now these are both, by coincidence, the same medical trial, right? How about the patient name? I'm going to use the letter Y, because only one of them do I see a letter Y anywhere, and now we're down to one, right? Okay, so we've shown that we can combine these, all three filter options, okay, and apply it. Of course, if I click clear, I just send, notice up here in the URL, right, it's got all those properties there. So right now, I'm looking for Dr. ID 35, medical trial ID 3, and the search string, the letter Y, right? The action button clicked was filter. That was at the last request that generated this page. If I click clear, that all goes away because it's like a brand new fresh GET request. No more filter in place. Good. So we've succeeded in putting our multi-stage filter in place. Just going to go on now. I mentioned at the beginning that we're also going to look a little bit at this Bootstrap Collapse idea, right? We saw how you can click buttons and have regions of the page expand and collapse. Well, you know, there's only 3 here, but still, if picture this on a mobile device, and half the screen is basically taken up just for this filter section, right? So sometimes it's something that the client might request that, you know what, I don't want this showing at the top of the page all the time. If there's no filters being applied, why do I have to take up so much screen real estate for this filter section? So that's going to be our next task, because we're going to play around with how we could actually hide that in a couple of different ways, right? We want to toggle the filter option, open and close, again, using that Bootstrap Collapse. So let me come back to the index view. And first, for my first version, I'm just going to add a slightly different version of the form. Sorry, I need to use the arrow keys, because when I use the mouse to select text, sometimes it goes running up to the top of the document. I'm sure you've had that happen to you as well, right? Okay, so let me select the form. Yeah, see, I should be using it here as well. Actually, I think by accident I selected the create new as well, so there we go. Okay. Oh, sorry, I grabbed the wrong one. Isn't that embarrassing? That was the same one that was just there. All right, so here's this revised version of the form. Okay, so what am I going to do? Well, I'm adding a button at the top, right? This button I'm going to click to either show or hide, okay? Now, this is a slightly different approach than actually I had in my code yesterday, which is why you'll notice in Blackboard that the copy-paste file now has a version number, version 1.1. Student pointed out something that, I showed 2 different approaches. I showed simply having it visible when there was a filter being applied and collapsed when there wasn't. But then I also showed the alternate approach of having it hidden, right, so it doesn't take up all that screen, even if there's a filter applied, and changing the color of the button to a nice bright red. The only problem is, and a student pointed this out yesterday, what about colorblind users, right? Well, in a sense, it would have probably been okay because the bright red button filled the whole background, even if it just looked gray to someone who's colorblind. Whereas normally my button had a white or a light colored background. So the color contrast probably would be enough, but we can help even more for a situation like that, right? So I'm going to take a 2-pronged approach today. So that's why I've modified the code. The other suggestion was, from the same student, why not show behind maybe the words filter search how many current filters are being applied? So I'm going to add, remember how view data works? We can put into the view data anything with a name, it's a name value pair, it's just a collection, name value pairs. So the value that we have specified here for this view data name, number of filters, will appear in the screen right here, right? Same thing for here for the actual class of the button, okay? All right, now the collapse itself, this is the div for the collapse, right? So right now I have it set so it will always be collapsed, okay? So we're gonna work with the button to use it to display whether or not there's a filter, and we'll leave the div always collapsed. We'll change that in a few minutes, but that's the approach we're doing right now. Okay, so coming back to the controller, to work along with that, we just have a little bit of a change to make. Okay, so I'm going to put my code with lots of comments. Hopefully it'll help explain it right at the top here. Okay, so we're going to count the number of filters applied. We'll start by assuming there are no filters. So assuming there are no filters, I'm going to set the value to our view data filtering to just this little CSS class as part of Bootstrap that will just make the button itself just outlined dash secondary, so it's just a light background with a bit of an outline, right? And we're setting our counter for how many filters are applied to 0. As I noted in my comment here, then for each test for filtering, we'll add 1, right, to the counter. So if I come down further, all I have to do is increment then my number of filters counter, right? So for each one. So was there a value for Doctor ID? Then I'm going to apply a where clause, and I'll add 1 to my count of filters. Same thing here, right? Same logic. And for the third one as well. So now, by the time I get down here, right, I'm going to put all my code in place. We can give feedback on the filters. If it's not equal to 0, right, then we have some filters being applied. So I'm going to change that initial value, right? Say view data filtering is button danger. That will give me my red background to the button that I was talking about earlier, right? Not a bad thing for sighted people. It'll stand out and really jump out on the page. For those that are colorblind, at least the button goes dark when before it was light. But that's not all we're going to do, right? I'm also going to set that number filters view data value, okay, based on the actual integer that I've added up. Number filters toString, and of course I'm just saying, that number filters s, add s to the end if there's more than one, apply, right? So that'll be right in the text on the button itself. Okay, so let's just run this and see that difference. We're almost done here, folks. This one shouldn't be too much longer. So bear with me, come here to patience. Right? So if I want to apply a filter, okay, again, I'll pick a doctor, for example, and there we go. So we're filtered, but we have this nice big warning, okay? It's certainly a dark background, even for colorblind people. It's nice, big, bright red for those that can see color. And I also have said 1 filter apply, right? So if I want to see the filter, I can just always click the button and see what filter has been applied, right? So if I want to add something else, the letter T, I can apply that as a filter. Now it says 2 filters applied, right? So I'm always getting that feedback. I know how many filters and what they are, and it doesn't take up any screen real estate, right, on the page at all, right? So I can always expand it when I want to see it, right? So that might be a good way to do it. It's entirely up to you, right? Now, if you wanted to, we could combine that with, okay, the approach of actually having it show the section, just to do that at the same time. So it'll actually be educational to do this. So that gives me a chance to talk about this div. So this is the actual div that we're opening and closing, the one we're collapsing. So basically, I'll just show you. If I hard-coded the word show in here, it will always be open. That's it. I don't even need to run it. Trust me, it'll just always be open. So what I'm going to do instead, right, is I'm going to actually put something that's going to come from view data into here, right? Instead of hard coding the word show, we'll add it when we want it, okay? So just as we've used view data to get information, we can stick something in that will appear in the page. Okay, I'll add a new view data name value pair for show filter that will just contain that keyword I just demonstrated, show, right? So then when I come back over to my controller, all I have to do is add one more thing down in here. We'll keep the Bootstrap Collapse open if there's a filter, right, in the same decision structure by setting view data show filter equal to the word show. Right? So if I just do a hot reload, I should be able to come back to the browser, and then I'll just do a clear first of all, right? Now if I have anything, not only do I get my red button, okay, it shows me how many filters are applied, but at the same time, right, it's keeping this open. Now of course if there's no data, right? I can go back to all doctors, and it'll go down to 1 filter applied, but I'm keeping this open. Now whether you want to do that, I'm just showing you all these different various approaches. Later on, I think I've already mentioned at the beginning of the term, we're going to look at how to change the whole layout on a smaller screen. So that would be a good opportunity then to change this approach, right? To make sure that even if we were going to show this on a full screen, on a small, narrow screen, we want to go back to hiding it unless they click the button. But that's in a future lesson to come. But that finishes our lesson for today, right? We've got all the code that was in our copy paste file in place now, right? Now, if you want to take that out, maybe I'll just comment it out for now, because I think the purpose was to actually, have it not be there visible. We can always click on it, and away we go. Okay, that's it. Any final questions before I stop the recording that you want to be included as part of our discussion? Well, in that case, this is a 30-minute recording as it is, so I'll stop it at this point now. Class isn't over, but I'm going to stop this recording.